Bienvenidos. This is a podcast that explores Latinx media and culture in its many forms. I am Dr. Rojo Robles.
And I am Dr. Rebecca El Salois. And we are Latinx and Latin American Studies professors at Baruch College in New York City. In this podcast, we will analyze Latinx film, television, literature, art, and cultures.
We will consider how these works are perceived, analyze them, and investigate the real-world reflections and implication of that work on Latinx cultures in the U.S. and beyond.
Welcome to Latinx Visions.
Bienvenidas, bienvenidos, bienvenides.
Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to Season 9 of Latinx Visions. This season, the hilo, connecting our episodes, will be the border, or borders, plural, really.
La frontera.
La frontera. And this season, we're talking about one of the most overexposed and yet most understood topics in U.S. public life, and that is la frontera. That is the border, right?
Yeah, politicians from both major parties have turned the border into a weapon, using it to craft narratives of invasion and war. They lean into fear, they lean into nationalism, they lean into plain racism.
Mm-hmm.
Migrants are painted as criminals, as threats, as faceless waves that must be stopped. But none of this is new.
No.
To really understand what's happening today, we have to see the border historically as part of a long continuum of U.S. expansion and imperialism, from Manifest Destiny, El Destino Manifiesto, and the war with Mexico, to the occupation of the Caribbean in and beyond 1898. The border has always been a stage for U.S. power to define itself against racialized others. What we're witnessing now is just the latest chapter.
Yeah, and here's the thing. Lawmakers, white supremacist pundits, and even centrist politicians know how effective the border is as a discursive tool. They use it to stoke fear, to justify mass policing, to normalize surveillance, and to keep the prison and military-industrial complexes humming. And we're seeing that much more blatantly now, right? It's always existed, but it's a lot more in our face. All those viral clips and bad faith arguments online about border crises, they rarely come with context or accountability. Their job is to make migrants disposable while strengthening the nation state's grip. And meanwhile, discussions about the border are probably at an all-time high in public life, as I was saying, but the rhetoric is shallow, it's empty. It's loud, but offers no nuance, no humanity. And that's why we decided that for our 9th season, Latinx Visions needed to enter the chat.
This season, we're centering Latinx voices, as always, artists, researchers, storytellers, graphic artists, who are offering counter-narratives, perspective that resist the flat, racist tropes dominating headlines. We'll highlight works that humanize migrants, that complicate the story, that insist on dignity over dehumanization. Above all, our goal this season is to remind listeners that the border is not a problem to be solved. Mm-hmm. It's a human reality to be reckoned with, one shaped by histories of colonialism and one still infused with possibility, stories of survival, resistance, and creativity that deserves to be heard. So join us. Let's look past the noise and into the visions that matter.
In our first episode for the season, we'll provide you with some background information on our film that we're discussing today, Who's Dayani Cristal, including who made it, what the goal of the film is, and how it approaches telling the story of one man who can no longer speak for himself.
Then we will dive into our main topics. I will start off by exploring the parallels between the film and Francisco Cantu's memoir, The Line Becomes a River, and Rebecca will discuss whose story gets told and how it gets told.
And in our connections segment, Rojo will consider the music in the film, and I'm going to talk about other migration narratives and how they approach telling these border stories.
So today we want to spend some time with a documentary that delves into the experiences of border crossing from Honduras to the U.S., Who's Dayani Cristal, as we mentioned, directed by Mark Silver and Gael Garcia Bernal. The documentary, released in 2014, also juxtaposes a landscape of death and one of hope and resourcefulness. At its core, the film asks, what happens when a migrant dies in the desert, stripped of name, family, and recognition? How do we remember them, and what does their death say about the border itself? How can we restore human dignity?
The documentary begins in the Pima County morgue in Arizona, where forensic investigators received the body of a man found in the Sonoran Desert. His only identifying marker is a tattoo across his chest that reads Dayani Cristal. From here, Silver and Bernal construct two parallel journeys, the scientific investigation in Arizona to restore this man's name, and Bernal's retracing of, or more so performing of, the migrant trail through Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico, and finally into the United States.
By weaving these two threads together, the film creates a testimonio, one that reminds us that this man, like so many others who died in the desert, is not a statistic. He is a son, a husband, a father, a worker, and a man with deep spirituality and hope for his and his family's future.
All right, so Rojo, why don't you get us started with your part of the conversation?
Yeah. One of the film's most sobering points is how death has become normalized at the U.S.-Mexico border. Experts interviewed in the film point out that the death rate in the desert has actually increased in proportion to the militarization of the border. Mm-hmm. We often hear that the desert itself is dangerous, as if nature were the culprit, como si la naturaleza fuera la culpable. But Who's Dayani Cristal, el documental, makes it clear that the desert kills because U.S. border policy has made it so.
Yeah, nothing was more profound to me than that moment when they showed, well, maybe not nothing, but it was quite a profound moment when they showed the map of where they put up all these border walls and said like, oh, well, now people won't go through the desert. And they can't go through here, so they just won't come. It's like, that's not how it works.
Yeah. The film uses mapping also. That is a good strategy to show like precisely like these arguments. Mm-hmm. So the film shows us how the Clinton and Bush administration in the 90s and then early 2000 doubled down on this logic, pushing migrants into harsher, more remote terrains so that the danger itself becomes a deterrent. But deterrence through death doesn't deter. That's what the film's main argument perhaps is.
Yeah.
It only dehumanizes.
Absolutely.
Migrants still cross because most time they have no other option. They walk into conditions that almost guarantee suffering and often death. This framing immediately reminds me of Francisco Cantu's 2018 memoirs, The Line Becomes a River. Cantu was a former border patrol agent turned writer that insists that the border is not natural. No es inevitable. It is an arbitrary line imposed into the land through war, treaties, and political calculation.
Yeah, and that's something we're going to explore even further throughout this season of episodes.
Yeah, precisely. That is something that is going to be a constant discussion this semester. Mm-hmm. So Cantu shows us that the violence of the border stems from this arbitrariedad. People don't die because the desert is inherently deadly, although, it is very extreme. But the book and the film present us with the reality that they die because U.S. enforcement pushes them into the desert.
Yeah.
So the border itself manufactures suffering. And here, the parallel with Who's Dayani Cristal is striking. Both the film and Cantu's memoir underscores that a line drawn in the sand can become a generator of violence. That the so-called Corredor de la Muerte in Arizona exists not by chance, but by policy design. Cantu also described how border patrol agents and the institutions that employ them treat migrants as objects. Water bottles slashed, clothing shred, belongings scattered as trash. All of this becomes a symbolic erasure. Migrants are not people. They are illegals or bodies.
And that's something that we get the visual representation of through the film, right? So you're talking about it in the context of this memoir, and it's further reinforced through the visual of the film.
Yeah, in a way, also the film tells the story of a body turning into a human, into a person, a human being with a family, yeah, with connections to an ecology, Honduras, with solidarity, friendship along the way in the migrant trail. So it's kind of like the transformation from the body to the human being.
Mm-hmm.
In the morgue scenes of Who's Dayani Cristal, we see the same erasure at work. Migrants who died in the desert need to be recorded as John Does. Yeah, their lives suspended in anonymity. Without names, without records, grief itself becomes impossible. The authorities then puzzle back to restore the personhood and the mourning process of the families.
And it was actually intriguing to see how they approach that and how there are people on this side of the border who are attempting to rehumanize these bodies.
Yeah. And we see that playing out both in the U.S., Mexico, and other countries as well. So it's a transnational process.
Yes.
But the act of naming or of telling a story becomes resistance. Yeah, Cantu argues that when we narrate these lives, when we grieve them, we restore dignity. And the film enacts these same gestures. It turns one anonymous migrant little by little into a human being with a face, with a family, with a history, and with a story to tell about his migrant journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cantu is also honest about the toll that witnessing this violence takes on the body and the psyche. He described nightmares, nosebleeds, anxiety, the way violence gets into his subconscious and left scars. Migrants carry the bodily injuries, the risk of death, the ruptures of family separation, as we see in Who's Dayani Cristal.
Yeah.
Agents like Cantu carry psychic damage, the weight of complicity. It is asymmetrical, evidently.
Yeah, of course.
Very importantly, it's important to say evidently it is asymmetrical, but it reminds us that the border corrodes everyone it touches.
Right, yeah.
In the film, Bernal takes on this burden differently and arguably lightly, and Rebecca will get more into this. By walking alongside migrants, eating with them, riding atop La Bestia, the train, he tries to feel el cansancio, la vulnerabilidad del viaje. It is an act of empathy through performance, but also of witnessing, placing himself in proximity to stories often ignored in political discourse.
Yeah, and it is, as you mentioned, something I will get into a bit more in my segment, but I do think there is an importance to sharing what that journey could look like with the viewer, right?
Yeah, it is in a way like it's a very complex gesture, the one that he's presenting, and I'm sure you're gonna give us more on that. But it's definitely like a way to bring the viewer into the long journey along different borders, because it's not only the U.S.-Mexico border, it's also like the Mexican-Guatemala border, right? And the different ways migrants move through these different spaces.
Yeah, and I do think showing that border crossing is just as important. You know, even though he says, like, there's not really a border here, that isn't always true depending on how the government, you know, he says at one point, like, oh, people are just like, there's no real like policing of this border between Guatemala and Mexico.
What Rebecca is mentioning is like a comparison of the Guatemala-Mexico border versus the Mexico-U.S. border.
Exactly.
And how they look different and people act differently in these two different spaces, even though both are borders.
Exactly,
right?
Yes.
Yeah. And yet, the film does something that I feel is very important, is to highlight that amid the cruelty of the border and the death, within those spaces, the film is presenting spaces of love and dignity. Migrant shelters along La Ruta hacia el Norte encounter or find spaces, with beds, soccer games, telephones, food, and prayer. And these spaces, estos santuarios, are very important for the well-being and to recharge, while they're journeying to the United States.
Right. Yeah. As you're saying, they're creating these sort of sanctuary type spaces for the migrants just to have a moment to be human on this journey.
Yeah. And here, Yeah, what we see in these shelters are that migrants are not disposable. They are honored as heroes of history. That is one quote that one of the people working in the shelter says in the film. And for him, people risking everything to is what they're doing is preserving life and possibility for them, for the families, and even for their countries.
Right.
Yeah, the shelters even frame the migrant as a Christ-like figure, sacrificing, connecting worlds, resisting despair. These views reframe the borderlands as more than a site of death, and that is very important, and it was deeply needed because of the painful aspect of bearing witness to the death in the desert. It is also this, we see that these spaces, estos albergues, are also a site of care, solidarity, and resistance, almost like a continuation of the historical Underground Railroad. Protection and guidance in the face of systemic political violence. Whose Dayani Cristal and The Line Becomes a River both insist that borders are no neutrales, no son neutrales. They are political systems of violence that dehumanize, erase, and kill. But they also remind us that storytelling, naming, grieving, singing, sheltering, can create a counter border, a border of care. To remember Johan and his family, among them his young daughter, Dayani Cristal, is to resist erasure and affirm that every migrant life is essential, that every crossing contains a story that we need to hear.
Yeah. For me, watching Who's Dayani Cristal for this episode, it was the first time I'd ever seen the film. And, we were talking about this before we started recording, I was a bit confused at first. I went into it knowing very little about it, just mostly that it was a documentary that took a forensic look at migration and the border. And then the first thing I see is Gael Garcia Bernal approaching a border wall and considering climbing it to cross the border. So that was the opening scene, the opening moment. And suddenly I'm questioning, is this a documentary? Is it not? Did I misunderstand this? And the reenactment or the play acting of crossing the border by someone with the privilege that Bernal has, it really threw me off.
Yeah, this perhaps falls more than a documentary, falls more into the genre of docufiction, right? Or this hybrid, as a hybrid piece that is kind of creating new narrative within documentary techniques.
Yeah, and for me, it wasn't enough biopic or fictional recreation, and it didn't. I think blending those two for me was a bit off-putting in moments. It's an
experiment that sometimes works, sometimes doesn't. Yeah, but we see I'm sure that you're gonna get into the elements that didn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. So shortly after this moment, it was confirmed that it was indeed a documentary, right? And one that told an important and often less considered story, right? That of identifying the deceased and notifying their families, and how difficult and honestly sometimes impossible that task can be. So what I want to talk about today is who gets to tell these stories, whose stories get told, and how do we tell them? Because as much as I appreciated what this film was sharing with us, I felt it was a bit exploitative at times. I'll get to that for sure, but I want to talk first about what worked and why I think this is a valuable film despite the fictional elements that didn't work for me. The first thing is this idea of border forensics, right? That's not something that's often considered in...
It's a very silent practice, right?
Yeah.
It's an element of the border and the stories about the border that is often veiled, right?
Yeah. And honestly, I knew very little about the practice of border forensics, and I did appreciate hearing from the different individuals who worked to identify these people who were brought to them. There was a lot to learn about the process and specifically the struggles with identifying these people, right? The lack of databases that have, information about people who maybe crossed undocumented previously and so on. And getting that information was difficult. So I thought it was important, as you mentioned earlier, right, to address the fact that Clinton and Bush really initiated many of the border policies that we still have today. This is not something new under the Trump administration. You know, sure, he's a lot louder about it, but this has been happening for decades. And we know this because this film came out before he even ran for president.
And it's very connected also. We haven't talked about that, but the war on drugs.
Yes.
Yeah, very of the 70s and the Nixon era.
Oh, it goes way back.
Yeah. And it goes back to the 19th century, as we mentioned at the beginning, right? But yes, right. But the militarization in specific, the type of militarization and policing is very connected to those two administrations,
right.
the Clinton and Bush administration. Yeah.
The initiation of these walls, right, really comes with their administrations. You know, we're told, as you mentioned, that undocumented crossings were down at the time this film was made, but that the deaths were up, right? It's because just as many people were attempting to cross, but majority of them were not finding success. So seeing this reminded me of just how much these people who are risking their lives to reach this country are treated like objects and numbers by the U.S. government. Their statistics, their data, like that's all they are to so many on the U.S. side of the border. They're just, as you mentioned, John Does. And I will say that there were moments, particularly with one of the forensic specialists, where I thought he was missing the real issue. You know, he talked about how we need to admit that there's a problem, which I can agree with, but the problem isn't what he was mentioning, right? He focused on how these people come and do jobs that U.S. workers won't do, and that we would experience a great loss if they were unable to come here. And I was like, sir, that's not it. That's not it. It misses the point, right? Why are these individuals making the trek from Honduras, from El Salvador, from Guatemala and other countries, right? What are the circumstances in their home countries and what caused those circumstances? And I'll give you a 3-word answer. The United States.
Maybe a good documentary to kind of like see alongside this one will be Harvest of Empire. It's also like from those years as well, and it is based on Juan Gonzalez's book, now canonical book, Harvest of Empire. But it gets more into how U.S. intervention in Central America, right, in Latin America has created this this crisis.
Yeah,
right?
And that's something I teach in my introduction to Latin American studies class.
That is part of Latino studies. That is part of Black Latin American story, right? We need to get into those stories here at BLS. And
that's...
But most people, for most of our students, every semester we get like, oh, this is new for me, right?
Yes, absolutely. And that's what I was going to say is that they hear these stories, but they're only hearing one side of the stories. They're not getting to the root. And that's what I think. I don't think this guy was malicious in his answer in the documentary. It's just that he probably also was not really taught those roots.
And he's presenting an argument from the point of view of economics, U.S.-centric economics, right? He's like, we should validate the migrants because they're like serving the U.S. economy. And that was something that was like a part of the discussions about essential workers during the height of the pandemic.
Yes.
Right? It's like this idea, no, we should value them because they're like serving the U.S. economy in a time of distress. Yeah, but we see that it's an argument that is only taking into consideration the economics of the imperial country.
Right. And I know that what I'm bringing up here really wasn't the focus of the documentary, so I don't expect that it would have been included. But I did feel that including the forensic experts' comments sent a message that we should let people cross the border because they'll do the labors that U.S. workers don't want to do. And I feel like that objectifies them in its own way, right? That they're just a source of economic growth for the country and not humans who are trying to make a living and to survive and to support their families and just to simply exist.
Yeah, and they're also like embodiments of a very complex history of colonialism and intervention and militarization and Cold War policy in the region.
Yeah, so that's what I wanted to kind of bring up, right? This idea of the U.S. playing a role in the migration from Central America and Mexico and other countries as well, being at its root, like the issue is colonialism and economic exploitation. It's also the supporting of dictatorial governments and actually the creation of them in some countries, right? It's sending arms to war-torn countries. These are all things that the United States has done that has pushed migration from the other countries in the Americas to the United States. In Hernan Orna's book, A People's History of Latin America, he discusses the U.S. interventions in Nicaragua, particularly dating back to Reagan. And he also mentions supporting Salvadorian military establishments to prevent what, the U.S. government called another Cuba. And even he addresses the exploitation by the United Fruit Company in Honduras. And these are all factors that play into these migration patterns that we're seeing today. At the end of his chapter on Central America, he writes, "The United States is determined to maintain its omnipresence in the Central American region. The details and consequences of American foreign policy in Central America should be understood by the majority of the American people. They are part of the problem as well as the solution." And I think that's a great point to bring up.
Yeah, Valeria Luiselli also has that argument that to really address the border, you need the cooperation and of multiple countries, right? That the solution is not coming only from Mexico or from Honduras or from El Salvador or from the U.S. It's about how can we engage in a dialogue that create different circumstances.
Yeah. I think another part of the film that really worked for me was the interviews with the family, right? I think this was really important. That's part of that humanization part of this story, right? There was no suspense as to whether or not they were able to locate Johan's family. And I think that's okay. That's an editorial choice that I think really worked in this case. We didn't necessarily know who he was. We didn't get his name until later in the film. But
and the last thing we get is his face, his photograph, right?
Right. But we do get to meet his family, right? And I think why this really worked was that these individuals consented to being interviewed. They had the opportunity to share their stories about Johan, and their perspectives really, really did help humanize the story that was being told. I think if it solely focused on the forensic aspect, it might have read as a bit cold. It wouldn't have added that human element. In an interview that I watched with Gael Garcia Bernal, director Mark Silver, and producer Lucas Ochoa at the Sundance Film Festival, they spoke to this idea of wanting to humanize the project, to have audiences understand that these are real people with real motivations and that their stories should be told. But one thing I struggled with in this film was the interspersing of the dramatic sequences with Gael. The way it was filmed, or the way it was edited maybe, made it seem like he was truly going on this journey. He was meant to be seen as one of the migrants. The film description tells us that he's trying to retrace Johan's journey. But, I find it hard to believe he would have done the whole thing. I mean, but I don't think that was ever tried to be pushed to us, that he was doing it beat by beat. It was almost like a highlights tour of the journey. I get it. It's a deadly journey. You shouldn't do the whole thing just for fun. Yeah, it just shouldn't. But what happened, what I was seeing was that he acted like he was really doing it. Like the people that he encountered on the journey didn't know who he was. And in the same Sundance Film Festival interview that I just mentioned, he was asked if people recognized him, and he said yes, because of course he's super famous in Mexico, and especially at that time. Like that was
Yeah, he's very famous globally. I will
globally.
say he's one of the most like recognizable faces of Latin American cinema, especially in the
Absolutely.
21st century, right? And also like he became kind of like a symbol of Latin American in many of the films of
Yeah.
this era. Also, let's remember that he played Che Guevara, young Che Guevara, traveling throughout Latin America in diaries, motorcycle diaries, right? Diarios de la motocicleta, right? There's also another film, Even the Rain, where he plays a filmmaker going into Bolivia to film or to shoot a film, about Columbus exploitation, but then he exploits the indigenous people in Bolivia. And in these films, what is interesting, I feel like that was lacking. I agree with you that that was lacking in Who's Dayani Cristal, is that there's a self-awareness, right, of the privilege of
An
Che Guevara,
acknowledgement.
and Gael also as an actor playing Che Guevara, and in the other film about a filmmaker, even coming from Latin America, also exploiting fellow Latin American people or engaging in similar practices of exploitation. Here, that self-awareness was lacking, right? As it's not, or at least it wasn't as clear as in those other films where those different perspectives and contrasts are really highlighted, and the positionality of the characters or the voices or the embodiments are really clear.
Yeah, yeah. And that's what I think was, like you said, lacking here, right? You know, as I was watching the film, I was thinking, okay, either he's fooling the people he's talking to, acting like he truly is a migrant just like they were, or he was fooling the audience, making us think that the people he was talking to didn't know him or what he was doing.
At one point, he kind of like mentions, and we were talking about this before, right? Before we start recording, and it's like he kind of like mentions or points out about the possibility that they're allowing him to play
he's
a part, or that
retracing.
he's kind of like rehearsing a role to some extent, that he's kind of like performing as, that he's kind of like a presence that is kind of like going through the different stages, but it's unclear,
Yeah,
right?
and even
and it's not
acknowledging-
very critical, that moment of acknowledging the performative aspect of his presence in the film.
And even acknowledging it doesn't make it okay to me, you know. And this is like, yes, this is what I'm doing, but should you? That's, you know, I just, like I said, it felt exploitative. Like when he was talking to the guy on the bus and showing him pictures of his daughter, like, is this his real daughter or was it just an act? Did that guy know who he was? You know, and I found it unlikely that this other man would have shared his true identity. He's like, oh, who are you? Where are you from? Where are you going? It's like, a lot of people are just very close-lipped on those sort of subjects because they don't want to be exposed.
Yeah.
And then there was another part where they were filming a young woman talking on the phone. And I was like, was that a real
shelter? Yeah.
Yeah, the shelter. Was that a real conversation? Was it a performance? Like, did she say, yes, okay, you can film me while I'm talking to, I don't know. It just, it read uncomfortable to me.
A question. In the interview you watched, with Gael and the director Mark Silva, do they talk about the ethics of the documentary in any way, or the any debate that happened while shooting the film?
Not really. There was another video that I watched, which was just with the director for Democracy Now!, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And she sort of attempted a question in that direction, but I felt like the director sort of skirted around the ethics element of that question.
Yeah.
It was more just like, this is how we did it. Yeah. You know, also the end of the film, right, when they return the body of Johan to his family in Honduras, this scene also felt a bit performative to me. Have you ever seen those like home renovation shows where they're like, move that bus, and then like they move the bus, and it felt like that to me. Like everybody was, okay, we're gonna do this, we're gonna like reveal this is the big thing. You know, don't get me wrong, it was a beautiful thing that they were able to do that, but having everyone standing outside in the dark at night as he returned to his hometown really felt staged to me. You know, and I can't say for certain what took place. That's just how it read.
Oh, I mean, there's an element of posing also, but it's very explicit that they're like posing with
some
the
of those moments.
Yeah,
That's
there's
for
like
sure.
something that is very clear that they're like posing for the camera and they're
Yes.
acknowledging the camera. Yeah, so
That part
it is
made sense.
Yeah. But there's a combination of is it really staged? Are they performing the return? Yeah, what is really happening? Yeah, again, like there's many experimentation in this film regarding what is like it put us in the terrain of being critical about the documentary genre, and this film could be like really interesting to analyze from that point of view, like the ethics of documentary, what a documentary does, what are the lines or the borders using, like cuáles son las fronteras del documental, yeah, to what extent they're really like telling a real story or creating a story
or creating the story.
So it's a very like interesting film that could
worth
allow
analyzing.
for worth analyzing and problematizing.
Yeah.
Es importante problematizarlo también.
Absolutely. You know, and the one thing that really got me about bringing his body back was it made me question, like, would they have been able to do that if it hadn't been for this film, right? So many people have their loved ones identified when they've lost them, you know, to the border, but they are unable to afford the costs of recovering the bodies and having their family members return to their home country. You know, it is an expensive process, and especially not as ashes. It was his body that was returned.
Yeah.
And again, don't get me wrong, I'm glad the family had this opportunity, but it makes me think about all the others who can't afford to do the same because no one's making a film about that particular story.
Yeah, we see la madre de Johan like talks about that, how grateful she is, not because of what happened, but the fact that she's able to mourn.
Yes.
Johan.
That was a beautiful moment.
Yeah. So she's like very like open about the importance of that moment for her, right? Or the fact that the body was returned.
And she's the one who speaks to recognizing that there are so many others that don't have that ability.
Again, the film is not very self-aware or about what it's doing, or it's not trying, or it's not problematizing what it's doing. Yeah.
Right. You know, and as I was thinking about what to talk about for this episode, I started to consider this exact thing, right? You know, how documentaries have the potential to be exploitative. And I found an article by Eric Weidman from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And this is what he had to say about like the exploitation that appears in documentaries sometimes. He said, but something is unsettling about the rise in popularity of documentaries. The recent notion that documentaries and all subgenres are not only here to teach, but to entertain has given rise to several questions. How can documentaries' main purpose be to entertain without avoiding the exploitation of their subjects? Have documentaries always been exploitative? Is there anything that can be done to combat the exploitation of documentary subjects? And like, I don't have all the answers to these questions, but I think what you're talking about, the problematizing of it, is an important first step.
Yeah, to bring the questions and to kind of like dig deeper into the ethics is very important.
Yeah.
At the same time, because these are like cases that we never hear about. Many times the people that are participating in these documentaries are very grateful about like having a forum to talk about the issues. That doesn't make it right, like in terms of the ethics and how the filmmakers are doing it, but there's also that aspect that we need to acknowledge as well.
We do, absolutely.
It opens a new archive, of sources that are addressing issues and topics and stories and affects that usually get completely erased, as we said in the beginning.
And that's why I don't really have a problem with the documentary aspects of this film. But, you know, in the case of Who's Dayani Cristal, the blending together of the formal documentary style with the dramatic sequences, that's where I found maybe that line becomes a little bit grayer, right? What's the line between educating, entertaining, and exploitation? And that's it's
A
not
poetic recreation. There's moments that are more like poetic recreation
Yeah.
with Gael, right? Like using the La Oración al Migrante, right? That are trying like more to are like addressing the topic from more of a poetic montage like point of view,
Yeah.
right? That it's more connected to like the essay film or the poetic film. Yeah, so the film is doing a lot, but it's not very self-aware of it,
Yeah.
of itself. Yeah.
Exactly. And so this interview that I was talking about with Democracy Now! And Mark Silver, the director, he says the documentary part is the discovery of this dead person in the desert, and we retrace that person or that person's family all the way back to Honduras and follow the body as it goes through this investigative process and returns home to the funeral. Because that case is about a dead man, we need to work out a way where we could breathe life and juxtapose the very tragic story of that person dying in the desert. And we wanted to bring life as a juxtaposition of death, and hence started to work out with Gael what would be the best way to do that. And, obviously this is the solution they came up with. I just unfortunately think it did the rest of the film a disservice. I think Gael could have gone on that journey as Gael. And met people and talked with people, and it would have been
Instead of
play acting, performing exactly.
as a migrant, doing the migrant role that
right. Just be like, I am
Johan
doing
did.
this because I understand that this is this is who I am. This is the journey I'm taking, and this is why I'm doing it. Not, oh, I'm a migrant from Honduras and this is my journey. I don't know. That part didn't work for me. That's all.
yeah. For me, like as I mentioned in my section, the part that kind of like contrasts or bring a life affirming message to the film is actually the shelters.
Yeah.
The presentation of these shelters, how they work, the opinions of the people there, the conversation that happened there. For me, that is more important than the Gael parts or his poetic reflections about being a migrant, right?
Right.
A thing that he's not. Right,
Exactly.
At least in that way.
Not in that way, right.
He's a migrant in Hollywood.
Sure.
Yeah, he's an actor who is a migrant as well, but in Hollywood with
the privileges of being able to come and go.
Yeah, with an easy visa, right, to get and even live in the United States very easily because he's famous and has those advantages as a famous person. Mm-hmm. We always like to connect our sources, and we already have done that, bringing like the book by Francisco Cantu, right, and thinking about other interviews, but we always like to create like some connection with other sources, or to think about how the films are creating connections, within it itself, right? And I want to talk about the music, I really like the music selection, but not because necessarily I like the songs, or that I do, but it's beyond that.
It's
right?
what the songs do, I imagine.
It's what the songs are doing. And the music woven in Who's Dayani Cristal, I think they're like very important because they're part of the storytelling. It's another layer of testimony. Again, that perhaps is more successful. Each song brings with it a history, a geography, and a vision of solidarity. Together, they help us think about the border not only as a space of death, but as a site of memory, resistance, and connection. And let's start with Calle 13's Latino America.
Okay.
These songs playing in the opening credit is a contemporary anthem by now, a call to remember the collective strength of the region. Calle 13 reclaims Nuestra América, Jose Marti's hemispheric dream, but updates it with the textures of today's struggles. That could be mining, corporate theft, displacement, and migration.
Sure.
And the song proposes that Latin America is not poor, not weak, but rich in culture, in music, in language, and most of all, resistance and refusal. El Coro reminds us that natural resources, rivers, and mountains cannot belong to corporations or nation-states. They are part of humanity's inheritance. And here, humans are the stewards of nature. By including Latino America, the film reframes the migrant not as an illegal or a body or an invaded, but as a vessel of this hemispheric spirit, someone whose journey embodies centuries of resistance to colonialism and neocolonialism.
Right, not just a body, but one that embodies.
Yeah, precisely. And then comes Yasin Bey, also known as Mos Def, with No Hay Nada Más. Here, the mood shift. Unlike Calle 13's epics, this track is stripped down, intimate, and fragile. It was played through a montage at the migrant shelter. Bey sings in Spanish, making an intentional gesture of solidarity with Latin American migrants while also carrying in the resonance of African American struggle and diasporic kinship. Diasporic as in the African diaspora.
Right.
Lyrically, it's about endings, finales, and radical change. About what's left after love or after loss. Is about mourning as well. In the context of the film, it feels like an elegy for the migrant's journey or even for life itself. But it also asks us to notice the beauty of the world, the landscape, the small moments of connection in the country or the city, even if in danger. Ironically, it's a reminder that crossing the border is about holding into joy and meaning even when the state tries to strip them away. By including this track, the film expands the frame. The U.S.-Mexico border is racialized in the same way other communities are racial, like Black, Arab, Indigenous, Latinx. And across these experiences, music becomes a way to bear witness.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that song does a great job of that in that moment.
And finally, the end credits. We have the documentary closes with a very important song in Leonard Cohen's catalog, The Partisan. And it's within this particular film, it's a haunting choice presented in translation.
Yeah,
it is,
I think that makes it even more haunting, right?
Precisely. The song originally tells stories associated with the French resistance during La Segunda Guerra Mundial, a time when people crossed borders in Europe and risked their life to fight fascistas. Its imagery sheltered comrades lost, los camaradas perdidos, frontiers as prisons, maps well into the story of migrants crossing the Sonoran Desert. To place these songs at the end of the film is to argue on the universality of struggle, that what migrants face at the border is not isolated, but part of a larger history of people resisting oppression, often at the cost of their lives. The refrain, freedom soon will come, then will come from the shadows, echoes like a promise. It says the migrant who disappears into the desert is not defeated. They become part of a collective memory, a shadow army of dignity, promising to return.
And as you mentioned, it really does help when we think about how this goes beyond the U.S.-Mexico border. It's a story of people and their struggles and oppression throughout the world, but also throughout history.
And global movement, right? So we see that the soundtrack is not incidental. It's an archive of transnational resistance. Calle 13 ties the migrant to a hemispheric Latin American identity. Yasin Bey whips in a Black diasporic and Muslim resonance of solidarity, and then Cohen situates the struggle within a global fight against fascism and white supremacy. And together, the three tracks stitch the migrant story into a historical fabric of survival and refusal.
Yeah, music in film is just so, when it's done well, it really drives home the messages. And I think even if you don't know these songs and you don't necessarily understand the lyrics or anything like that. Or maybe know
the artists. Yeah, there's an element that comes from these songs. And I feel like it is a successful aspect of this film.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say.
We have mentioned, we have been critical about the film. Not everything feels
I think
that is very well done, but the song selection is very successful.
And like you said, it takes, like the music goes on the journey that we as the viewers should go on the journey as well. Well, I wanted to talk a little bit about some other migration narratives. Like I said before, I struggled a bit with the way the story was told. And I think that a film medium for this sort of retracing the step story, at least how it was done here, is tricky to pull off. And that's what we've talked about throughout the episode. So it got me thinking about other border stories and how they're told. Now, we're going to cover a few more things this season, so I won't go into those here. But as I was watching the film, one of the books that came to mind was Solito by Javier Zamora. And Solito is a memoir about Zamora's journey as a 9-year-old child from El Salvador to the United States in 1999. It was a journey that he, in essence, took on his own. I mean, he was with others. He did have a group, but his parents were already in the U.S. And if the members of his group had been unsympathetic about a young boy traveling without his parents, like, he never would have made it. He created a family within his migration journey with a mother figure, a father figure, and a sister. And in fact, many of the members of his initial group did not make it. So if you haven't read it yet, please do. If you're into audiobooks at all, he reads it himself. And I think it really doubles down on the impact of the story being told, because he tells it at a very measured pace. And so he also tells it from the perspective of his 9-year-old self. Right? He's not necessarily looking back. He's kind of going on the journey throughout.
Zamora also has a poetry collection that also is like addressing this period in his life. Like many of the poems are like autobiographical.
Yes.
And they're also like telling or presenting us like an aspect of this journey. So those two books perhaps can like be interesting
in conversation.
In conversation, of course, within Zamora's work, but also like as different takes of narrating or presenting these stories.
Yeah, and I think, just like Johan's story from Dayani Cristal, like, it is an important story that needs to be told, and it's a story that humanizes the migration experience. And another book that, I read this a while back, but it's another one that I think humanizes the migration experience is The Devil's Highway by Luis Alberto Urrea. That book follows 26 men who attempted to cross the U.S.-Mexico border in 2001. And again, thinking about these years and the fact that, like, we were talking about Clinton and Bush and so on, like, these stories, it's no coincidence that they are from that era, right? I picked them with intention here. This is another partial, like, retracing of Stepp's border narrative, but without the visual medium, I think it makes it seems more like, okay, this is research, these are interviews. It wasn't like, watch me go on this journey. It was, let me help recreate this journey through the process of these interviews and these talks, which is not something you can necessarily do with Johan's story because he didn't survive, right?
Yeah, precisely.
In the author's note at the beginning of The Devil's Highway, Urrea explains how the book came to be. He acknowledges many sources and addresses the importance of interviews and travel. He did travel. He also explains that he had unprecedented access to documents and reports from both Mexico and the United States. So it's that acknowledgement of where he gets his information, how he's telling the story, and why he's choosing to tell it in the way he does.
Yeah, I feel like also like going back to who's Dayani Cristal, although I really appreciate the voices and perspective of the people working in Arizona, I felt that I needed also voices addressing those issues, forensic or otherwise, but from the point of view of Latin America, right?
Yeah.
So we have the pathos, right, of Johan's family. We have the emotional aspects. We have the more personal, anecdotal perspective of his family. But I was missing like research. I was missing like people doing that work also, right, in Mexico, or thinking about what the border and the desert means, but from the point of view of Mexico, from the point of view of Honduras, from the point of view of Central American scholar, researcher, intellectual, right, doing this type of work.
Yeah.
So I'm glad that you're bringing these other recommendations,
It
right?
just sort of helps round out this understanding that we can have. If we rely on only one story from the border, one telling of a person's experience, then it's not going to be enough. We have to sort of create a fuller picture, right? Urrea also acknowledges in his book that some of the conversations were implied, right? When you're recreating these sort of moments, again, it's that acknowledgement. He explains how in the book, these moments are shared without quotation marks. So we as the reader can say, okay, this was not a word for word. This wasn't a verbatim conversation. This is just sort of implied as to how it would have gone. And so maybe perhaps this is similar to the creative liberty taken by Silver and Bernal in Who is Dayani Cristal. Again, a very important story to tell, a lot of great things to come out of it. I completely agree with you. It's the kind of film that should be watched and talked about for the strengths as well as the weaknesses.
Yeah, from the content, from its discourse, but also from the point of view of form and what the form is doing in these cases. I feel like it's very important. It's important to highlight that we have a course in BLS. Yeah, shout out to Lisbeth, who is teaching this course, the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, we have that course. She's been teaching it, and she really humanizes that experience as well through a lot of her mural projects and so on.
Humanizing deportation also, so it's similar to the type of practice that these filmmakers and artists are trying to do.
Yes. In this episode, we made reference to a number of books, videos, and songs, and we'll be sure to list these resources in our show notes if you're interested in exploring this topic in further detail, and we highly recommend it.
As always, thanks for joining us, for listening to us. If you have anything to add to the conversation, you can always reach out to us on social media or by email. Follow the podcast on Instagram and Blue Sky at Latinx Visions. Our email address is latinxvisions@gmail.com. And we would love to include your thoughts in a future episode.
Subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. Share us with your friends and family. Subscribe and leave a 5-star review to help others find the pod.
Ya compartan sus links con familiares, con amigos, con colegas. Queremos expandir más nuestras voces en el análisis y las personas que se unen a nosotros.
And be sure to stay tuned for our next episode where we'll continue the conversation around children's literature and the border.
Estamos a la escucha.
Dale. Until next time.